Thank you guys for taking the time to come. Today we are going to speak a bit about retention, a bit about myself. So I'm Jonathan, I'm a regional director at Adjust. Been at Adjust for 2.5 years. Actually, I came up with the idea of retention because 2 years ago, slightly before the pandemic, I was with one of the leading CEOs in our industry, and we were speaking about late 2019, how 2020 is going to be, right? It's going to be interesting with all expected acquisition and mergers. Obviously, no one could predict what is going to be with all this crazy pandemic that now we are going out through. We have been going through waves, and with the wave, the retention go ups and down. And then I say, okay, I have to speak about it. And in this case, I just wanted to also bring some of the leading clients, some of the leading experts in our industry to share their thoughts about what they have been seeing in the last 2 years and speak specifically about retention.
Hey everyone, I'm Vito. I'm heading performance marketing at Monzo. I've been at Monzo for 2 years. Excited to be here. Hopefully I can answer a few questions that you'll have. But yeah, this should be exciting, so we'll try and make it as engaging as possible.
Hi everyone, I'm Malik. I'm currently head of user acquisition at Moshi Kids. I've worked kind of in the gaming and mobile marketing space for basically my whole career. Before that, I was at Apple and then started my career at King. So I've kind of seen all sides of things and really excited to speak a bit about what we're doing today in retention.
Hi everyone, my name's Richard. I look after our technology partnerships for Mixpanel. So for anyone who's not familiar with Mixpanel, we're a self-serve product analytics company. So we give power to teams to understand how their users engage, convert, or retain. And so we're on a nice retention panel today. And these teams leverage our technologies to understand the ebbs and flows of their products so they can ultimately make better product decisions on their data. But yeah, excited to be here.
Hi everyone, I'm Eleni. I'm taking care of the UK clients for Just. I'm the customer success manager for the region. And really excited to be here today. Thank you.
Great, so let's kick it off. So yeah, back to the initial phrase that I started. How would you say that you were seeing 2020 compared to 2021? For example, if you say when the pandemic started and then throughout the pandemic in terms of retention, what are the key learnings that you got and what you can share also with the audience from your experience?
Should I take
this?
Yes. Okay. So I'd say back in 2020, we were in a very different space to where we're now. Obviously on iOS, we didn't have all of iOS 14, 15 kind of data privacy kicking off. So back in the days, we could get really kind of specific with how we did retention marketing for specific users. So we would be able to track them in a very specific way. And actually tailor messaging based on how they would use the product. Now, since the start of 2021, that's kind of changed. So if you look at it under the iOS lens, specifically, we have to leverage a lot of other own channels in order to actually continue the same levels of engagement and retention for our customers. So I don't know how many of you have know about Monzo or kind of see Monzo on social channels, but we're trying to engage customers now through current conversations that are happening in the banking industry. We try and leverage the digital space a lot about what people engage with in their daily lives. So using data to inform how we can use memes, for example, which is something that not a lot of banking clients banks do in general. So I think it's shifting more from using paid channels to keep that retention up to more own channels. So yeah, email, social channels, etc. So very different space.
Yeah, I think it's exactly the same from what I've seen. I mean, to be fair, I've switched jobs twice during the pandemic, so have seen things shift a lot as well, but completely agree. Everything kind of hyper-personalized back in 2020 to the point where the creatives, the offers, and everything that you're using across your paid is completely personalized. Versus now, I think it's a combination of really making sure that CRM is as closely integrated with your entire marketing funnel as possible, but also starting to think about how you reach people more broadly in a way that can actually engage them on kind of a day-to-day basis and make sure that, again, another buzzword of 2020, but that they're really integrated in your community and your ecosystem for what you're building as a product.
I think from our perspective, over the last couple of years, we've seen for brands, digital transformation has either accelerated, like somewhat, or even started for some brands and companies. So I think sectors that were set up well to be prepared for this wave of users just leveraging their mobiles more than ever before. So fintech's a really good example of that. Have probably set themselves up well for the future and coming out of the pandemic. They're in a good position, whereas perhaps some other brands that weren't quite ready for that or weren't expecting that are now really having to cherish their users. And it's great that we get to talk about retention today, because I think that's now more important than it's ever been before. And I also think how people or how brands measure like retained users has changed as well, because historically you might be looking at, I just want to really retain my power users because they're driving value or revenue or whatever it might be. Whereas now I think, having come through the pandemic, a lot of brands just want to retain users, just full stop. So I think that like cohort of users has changed like quite fundamentally as well.
Yes, I agree with what we were saying, Rich, and maybe doesn't apply to Vito and Malik, but we do have a lot of clients that, at the beginning of the pandemic, they realized that they need a stronger focus and presence in the digital world, and they started building that one. And the proactiveness that some clients have showed, that eventually we're going to go out of the pandemic, and how are we going to retain these clients after the pandemic ends? Because some of them are, did flourish during the pandemic, and how can you retain these clients after that when we go back to normality again? So we've seen quite a lot of different approaches, and what I saw mainly from our clients that those that were proactive are in a very good place right now on how they were handling their strategy, their retention strategy.
Yeah, I think this is actually the big thing, right? Is I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all approach to retention the way that maybe there was in the past. I think it's really about conceptualizing what you want your user experience to be and trying to understand what touch points you still actually do have control of, rather than just saying, I'm going to create a segment of users who I want to kind of consistently expose to my marketing in order to try to keep them in the funnel. It's about how do we make sure that the touch points we have actually keep people engaged wherever we can.
Also, just one point on that is your like definition of retention changes over time. So you build like a cohort of users based on what you feel was, this is what I want my retained users to do and behave, and then you see how they actually go on and behave with your product and with your app, and that actually changes over time as well. So I think there's a lot of learnings, especially over the last couple of years, where your concept of what's a good user has changed because the way they've interacted with the product has changed as well.
Yeah, completely agree.
So we were speaking a bit about, and we mentioned, Malik, about the touch points, right? And as well from banking perspective, how would you say that retention is important in your funnel, right? Because you're looking into retention, you're looking also on other indicators, and what would be the benchmarks that you are taking to measure and you say, okay, this is actually working for me? Vito?
Shall I just go?
Yeah.
So if I take the banking industry specifically and I contextualize it with what happened in the pandemic, one of the key drivers of revenue, for example, for Monzo, is transactions, so fees on transactions, and that's basically merchant fees, so partnering with MasterCard or the likes of Visa, etc. During the pandemic, obviously, people started going out less. Like you were under lockdown. We saw revenue drop a lot. And one of the things we had to do was understand exactly, okay, how do we monitor the different touch points that customers have in order to understand when to market them and when to message them without coming across as persistent or pushy in a very sensitive time. We take this approach across everything, like always. So even today, with everything that's happening in Russia, for example, we decided to really scale back the touch points, how many times we actually want to engage with our customers, because we know it's a sensitive time. So yeah, I'd say contextualizing everything you do from a CRM perspective, which is one of the ways we actually measure measure how well we're doing in terms of speaking to our customers is super important. And yeah, I'd say that's the main thing, really.
No, I agree completely. I think like it's so easy as mobile marketers to just look at a bunch of data points on aggregate and say, oh, this is what my retention looks like. How can I try to increase this by 1% or something like that? The reality is if you zoom out, every single user is an individual, has their own life, and you actually have to think about more of like a life cycle marketing approach of like what might be happening to drive this. We're a kids app, for example. We have content for kids from 0 to 10. What we see quite a lot is actually, parents might be using our app for their children from, let's say, 1 to 3 years old, and then they stop actually for a year because it's not really relevant to them. But then they come back when they reach another phase in their child's life and it actually becomes relevant again. So I think it's really about just understanding what the behavior is. I'm a huge advocate of like focus groups and customer interviews and really trying to understand what's going on behind the numbers and then trying to take that and say, how can we actually structure a funnel and visibility on this to be able to actually measure it more consistently?
And this is actually quite interesting because you're looking for different perspective from the kid perspective, but also from a banking perspective. And in the end, both of you want to increase your retention and you are having different audiences and different ways to do that. So what is the secret sauce, right? What are you using to increase this? You don't have to say everything. You can say some of it. Just leave it a bit, for you, right? But Malik, what do you say that is your way to do, like to increase your retention in your case?
Yeah, I mean, if I knew the answer, maybe we'd be even bigger of a business. But I think for me, there's two pillars that are critical. One is like content, like what are you actually communicating to these users to try to make them retain more, to try to make them more engaged? And the second is measurement. And I think measurement is probably the biggest area of differentiation, I think, between people today. A lot of people I've seen still trying to hold on to a more deterministic, attribution-focused approach to retention. I think the approach we take quite a lot is more on like, trying to understand incrementality and using causal impact measurement tools and stuff like that to understand, if we invest in like building more social content, for example, what actual impact does that have? So I think it's about thinking about the user journey, figuring out what content you want to actually promote, and then coming up with a measurement framework that's appropriate for measuring that specific user interaction. And
just to dive a bit into that, so when do you actually know that this is working for you? Like, for example, you say, okay, if it's reached my target in day 14, so is it okay? Would you say, okay, I would just focus on other, for example, on increased monetization and so on? Or would you still continue to follow for day 30, day 60, or?
Yeah. It's a good point. I think that's actually another differentiation. There's like kind of the onboarding retention, like can you actually get people not just into the funnel, but through that first phase where they're really building a routine and incorporating the product into their daily life. And then there's the kind of the ongoing retention of your user base and trying to make sure that those people stay engaged. So in the short term, I think what we really look at is, do people reach their first renewal point or a subscription? And how do we maximize kind of month one renewals for us? And then for the ongoing user base, it's how do we maximize kind of engagement, number of opens per week and stuff like that. For us, it's an audio app primarily, so how many times people play a song throughout the week or a story. That's kind of how we look at it.
Amazing. Vito, what you say from your side?
I mean, it's very similar. We always try and position ourselves when we think about retention under the lens of a social platform. So one of the things that we measure is like churn rate or how many times a user on average uses the banking app, which is actually like something realistically we don't have a lot of control on because the way people actually use an app, a financial services app, is pretty conditional on whether they can actually spend money or not. So one approach that we've taken in Monzo is very product-led. Touching on what Malik said as well, we try and engage customers not only through how we communicate them via own channels or paid channels, but also through the product itself. So we'll be building certain features which are very social heavy. Things, for example, like how can you make the financial services experience very relatable? I don't know how many of you are Monzo users. I hope there's going to be at least one, maybe not. Me too. Okay, great.
3 yesterday I downloaded.
Okay. Well, one of the things we try and do is twofold. One, as I said, build products which are actually engaging and relatable. So making the experience as seamless as possible, especially like when you're with your friends. A great example was a few months ago, WhatsApp kind of crashed. And what we saw happening from an engagement perspective was we put out a piece of content on LinkedIn, which was essentially saying, okay, how can you get past this barrier of communication, which, you know, every one of us probably uses WhatsApp. Well, a lot of Monzo users started using Monzo to communicate with different people, with their friends, by just sending 1 pence and making the payment and using the reference as the message. And that was exceptional to see how our product was being used. And we kind of played on that, and we put out a lot of content on social channels to actually show how you could use the product. And we saw the number of 1 pence transactions spike during that day. That was incredible to see. And yeah, so building products that are really, really customer focused and that people can use outside of the main scope of the app, for example, which is a banking app, which on average is pretty boring to use, right? So we're trying to keep users engaged from that perspective. One final thing I'll say, which I started off in my previous answer, back on revenue. One of the ways we measure retention is how many users actually continue to make a transaction with Monzo. We have different definitions for different types of users. So for example, for us, super engaged users are defined as full Monzo users. And that means that they use our app as their main banking app. One of the things that we struggle with is improving that element of trust, which I'm sure we'll touch on as well later. But for us, that's one key metric, i.e., are we their main bank? And if not, what can we do to actually make sure that we push through that trust barrier, which for the financial services industry is a pretty big one to overcome.
It's actually quite interesting because we started from retention and something very, I would say, basic, right? Like, okay, I want to measure my day 3, but you are taking it like for another whole world, right? For your example, as a bank, right, you are looking even deeper in what your users are actually doing with it. So you can use it just as a teaser, but obviously you can take it and expand it according to which one you need, if it's from the banking perspective, also for a kid perspective.
Yeah.
This is quite interesting. Actually, I want to take this question to the audience, and I see there is Busu here and Kayak. You're the two ones that I saw here. What would you use in your case in terms of your methods to increase retentions? You don't have to say everything, just some of the stuff.
Yeah, I would say a lot of it is starting to gear towards content. A lot of what we've done has been at the bottom of the funnel working up, which isn't necessarily the way to do it, right? You want to come from the top down. But yeah, content, which you guys have mentioned a lot of, and then also the measurement. We're only just about getting to where we need to be with it. We've kind of starting to leverage more tools and seeing actually, what different types of users do. So we're a language learning app. We operate in loads of different countries, and again, it's not one size fits all. There's people different ages, different languages learned. There's so many different combinations, and yeah, it's just, I would say the measurement is the hardest thing to kind of get a hold of, just because there's so much data.
I believe also specifically for Busu, right? It takes time for you to attach this user that he comes back and you want to still continue learning. So for you also, the retention is the key to actually say, okay, this is actually hitting my benchmark in terms of, okay, he didn't come for 1 or twice, he didn't sign up to learn English or French, but he just continued more and more. And this is quite interesting. And from Kayak perspective as well, what would you say on your side?
I think it's also important to understand in which phase of the user journey they are, to actually get like content that is very specific to that person specifically. So yeah, I think like personalization, trying to really work very closely with products to understand the user cycles a bit better.
Amazing. Different perspective. So Richard, what would be the use cases that you see with Mixpanel?
Sure, yeah. So like entirely dependent on the vertical, of course. So maybe taking an example of like a gaming developer, right? It could be a very basic retention strategy where you're obviously having users download your app. They're ideally completing like a level 1, for instance, and then your retention metric might be how and when do they go on to complete level 2 or start level 2, and that could be a retained user for you because they've engaged with the product and then they've gone on and done something else. I kind of think of it in two different ways. We have like on retention and on and after retention. So on retention is when, using that same gaming developer example, you have a event which is level 1, and then you aspire to that user to go on and do event 2 or event B, which is level 2 in this game. And you actually set the time frame from when that is. So they've completed level 1, and then you want them to go on and complete level 2 within a week. So you define that time period. So that's like an on retention strategy. Or what's probably more commonly used and more applicable to a wider range of businesses is just on and after. So yes, they've completed that level 1 in the game, but actually you want them to go on and complete level 2, but you don't really care when that is, and you just want to get that learnings back so you can understand why does it take this cohort of users 3 weeks to go and do level 2, and it takes this cohort of users like 3 days, and then you can iterate the product based on that. So that's kind of some like basic examples of how to leverage it.
It's also about verticals, right? Because we see completely different strategies on, let's say, e-commerce than what we see on fintech or whatever. It's a completely different ballgame. But I wanted to say from the Adjust perspective on the measurement that Ramis was mentioning before and Vito, that we see, I mean, obviously, apps have different kind of strategies based on where they are at the moment in terms of like, if are they a new app and they are focusing on user acquisition, or their business model or business strategy is focusing on user acquisition, that's fine. Everybody's having like different strategies. Some of them are focused on user acquisition and some on retention, some both. But what we see is that unless you have everything in place in order to measure how your users are behaving, if you switch like quite, at some point you will switch to retention focus, obviously, if you're not doing it at the moment. If you don't have that in place, how are you going to be able to understand what your users are doing and how they're behaving, and what you were saying, Malik, earlier about how the UI are these users, behaving like that within the app. So if you don't have this data in place, then it will be like a problem, obviously.
Yeah,
This is where measurement comes, and
it's easy to waste a lot of time and money.
Yes.
Like just marketing to users who don't really care about it and actually are just going to keep having their own experience of the product and go through their own cycle. And I think it's really about, I also think about retention. If you think about another way of thinking about it, it's just churn prevention, right? Yes. How do we actually make sure that we're providing users with content that makes them stay engaged, that makes them stay with you as a loyal user, and how do you actually give them that message? So I think
can I ask you too, like when it comes to retention metrics, do you have a set defined metric that you almost have as like a North Star, and then you also just take learnings from like the other users, or is it's like a blank page and you just look at your user and then build your retention strategies off that?
Yeah, so at Monzo we have a lot of different metrics we'll look at. So we'll have a high-level metric, which is just growth from an acquisition perspective. We'll also look at weekly active users. So how many people that have activated with us, that have an open account, a Monzo account, actually go into the app recurringly and use us. And we can get really specific with how, like, the frequency that we want to see a user go into the app, which is going to be dictated by what's happening in the environment. Again, going back to the lockdown example, when people weren't able to make transactions, there was nothing really in our control that we could do, because the whole banking system was affected by it, and also our daily lives. We will also look at how individuals are using specific features or products within our app. The one thing I'd say, which is really difficult with fintechs in general, is that when you compare it to a gaming app, for example, the checkpoints that you can set are always very linear. So you can be very specific in saying, I want user to start the game, complete checkpoint 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and you can set very specific timings as to when each checkpoint needs to be completed. With banking apps, for example, once you've opened an account, there's a whole series of possibilities of how you can use the app. You can stay on the free account, for example, but there's different features you can use. How often you use them and how you use them is really important for us to actually understand. But then there's upsells, which also happen in the gaming industry. After how long should you speak to that customer to try and introduce them to that paywalled product? Why is it beneficial for them? From a seasonality perspective, does it make sense to push on that product? So there's a lot of different metrics that we'll kind of try and measure based on what we're trying to do, and based on what kind of product or feature we're trying to actually push for that user journey and we'll always try and do that in a way which we think makes sense for the customer. So if we see that a user is using a product in a way that it doesn't make sense for us to try and upsell a specific like subscription product that we offer, then we won't do that because we think it's gonna hinder the user experience. So every time you think about retention, you should also be thinking about user experience and if it has a positive or negative impact on the customer and as a whole.
Yeah, I think completely agreed. I think, Rich, also to answer your question, I think it just fundamentally comes down to whatever your business or revenue model is. Like ultimately, let's be honest, the main reason we care about retention is also because it drives revenue, right? If you are an app, let's say, an ad monetization based game, the North Star KPI for you is really just usage. It's making sure that people come back day after day, create habit. For us, as a subscription app, the critical kind of North Star metric we think about is first renewal, right? Because for us, that's kind of the final phase in the first part of the funnel. So user hasn't just subscribed, but they've actually gotten enough use out of the product that they want to continue their subscription at that first moment where they can actually choose to stop. After that, we kind of differentiate between what I would say is like payment retention and usage retention. So again, kind of renewal rates all the way down the funnel are really important for us, but then there's also that usage. So we know obviously that there's a huge link between how frequently people actually use the product and what their renewal likelihood is going to be. So we look at both of those things separately, but renewal rates are kind of the North Star KPI for us.
Malik, to add to that, so obviously you are investing a lot on making this first purchase, like this first subscription, right? But in certain point, this subscription about to end and they don't want to renew, you keep, for example, sending them deep, like you put like deep linking, retargeting, re-engagement, but in certain point you say, okay, this person will never come back. So when you say, okay, this person is a churned user, and you say, okay.
That is a very good question. Yeah. I mean, I think for us, it's still relatively binary. Like if you end your subscription, we consider you churned. It doesn't mean that you're never going to kind of have another relationship with us, but we consider you a churned user. We do a ton of like post kind of cancellation surveys and stuff like that to try to understand the causes for churn. And then based on that, it might be that a user says that the reason that they churn is just because of the price. In that case, maybe you're not fully churned. Maybe we can kind of reactivate you with an offer. Mm-hmm. Maybe they say that actually their child's not using the app and it's not really creating value for them. In that case, that's probably more of a hard churn. There's never a perfect way of thinking about it because I think people don't think about their usage of apps in such a binary way either. Like, I don't know if anyone has any apps where they say, oh, now I'm deciding to churn from this app. I'm a lapsed user now. No, you might just stop using. You're like, I'm not getting value from it today, but maybe in the future it's going to be part of my life again. So it's quite easy for us, kind of, because we just look at subscription status, but it really comes down to why people stop using it and if there's really an opportunity for us to do something a little bit different to actually help them re-engage with the product. So
it will be more like, for example, you will segment this user. For some of them, say it's worth it, and some of them it doesn't work.
Exactly. I mean, we probably wouldn't, if we know that a user has stopped their subscription because they're not using the app, their child wasn't getting value out of it, and we don't have any new content or new features in the app to promote to them, there's no point in us wasting our marketing budget to try to reach them. And there's no point in even overloading them with like email and push and stuff like that because you strain the relationship with them. If we know that it's because the price point was too high, or if we do have new content or a new feature which we can share with them, that's a different conversation.
Nicely said. And from a banking perspective, right? So how would it be like? Obviously, for you, a churned user, it's what do you define it, right? It's a guy that doesn't put any money, or just what do you define a churned user?
Yeah, so first of all, like it's important to understand what we define as a user. And for us, a user is anyone who has the ability to make or receive a payment. So they have an open account. And we can think of churn in two different ways. One is from a usage perspective, like do they have an open account, but they're just not using us? In that instance, there's a lot of things we can do in terms of sending them relevant content, speaking to them in a way that we think makes sense to them. There's the other perspective, which for us is a pretty binary definition, which is have they closed the account? If they've closed an account, there's not a lot we can do apart from understand why that is. And we can do that through, as Malik was saying, surveys, but we also have an important function for us, which is customer support, which is massive in the banking industry. Like one of the main reasons why customers churn is predominantly either they found a better user experience somewhere else, or they just don't trust the bank enough to actually make a full switch and they only want one bank account. So putting a lot of emphasis on customer support for us is really, really important. And it can make or break whether a customer actually decides to stop using us.
Yeah, and can I tell a quick anecdote that I was telling Vito before? I remember like 4 years ago, I was like on a night out with 3 friends, 2 of us Monzo users, 1 of us another competing banking app.
We cannot mention their name.
And of course, like this was all like very early days of kind of the new wave of fintech apps, right? And all of us had forgotten the pins for these cards. So I was on customer support chatting with someone at Monzo. Within like 10 minutes, I had my pin back for my app. Now I know you can just do it directly from the app. Yeah. But I remember like talking to the customer support agent and just being like, oh, my friend is also waiting in the support line. Can you go help him now? And literally 2 seconds later, he was speaking with my friend. The other guy using a different app was waiting there for like 30 minutes. And I don't know actually whether they got their pin back. But point is, like, I think customer support, that experience is something that stuck with me. And I completely agree. It's huge for retention.
Yeah. Best advocate for Monzo. So maybe we have a couple of more minutes, guys. Let's maybe go through your prediction for 2022. Richard, what do you think is going to be this year in terms of retention?
Yeah, I think there'll continue to be an acceleration of subscription. So I think obviously you play in that field, there might be a little bit more competition, but I think a lot of app developers and businesses have trialed subscription as a means to keep users retained and obviously a continual revenue stream as well. So I think that will accelerate, and it still makes up such a tiny portion of the App Store like number of subscription apps versus none, and I think that will continue to accelerate, especially in the gaming space. I think people will trial that as an area that probably we didn't really see 4 or 5 years ago. I think from like a data perspective as well, like what we're seeing at Mixpanel with a lot of our customers is breaking down silos and leveraging like a data warehouse to store all of their first-party event and behavioral data, and actually having that as a single source of truth and pushing that out to the various platforms like Mixpanel, like Adjust, and various others as well. So I think like infrastructure-wise for a lot of businesses, it's gonna accelerate this year more than it has done in the past.
Yes. And especially also for e-commerce, we see that quite a lot with our clients, and also the trend is the acceleration that you were saying, Richard, on e-commerce, apart from any other verticals.
What would you say, guys? Let's start with you, Malik. What is your prediction for 2022?
Can I give 2? I think one is like, it's actually going to be a very tough year in a lot of ways for different verticals of app developers. I mean, there's so much stuff going on in the world right now, like different economic challenges in different countries. There's a lot of stuff going on in terms of just people's daily lives that actually make it very difficult to prioritize, in-app purchases and stuff like that. So I think there will be challenges, and I think it means that people have to really invest in maintaining that relationship with customers. And I think the second prediction is really that there will be an acceleration of people building measurement products that are really more suited for kind of the environment from a privacy standpoint that we have today. So more kind of aggregated approach to measurement, more development in terms of causal impact and media mix modeling, whether that's building in-house or products that you can pay for as a service.
You stole my answer. I was going to say, yeah, we're going to be moving more towards MMM modeling. It's going to be fundamental in order to evaluate both acquisition and retention strategies holistically. I think at the moment there's quite a dichotomy between the two areas of marketing. And I think we have to start looking at them more holistically, and MMM is one of the ways you can do that. And yeah, I think you'll see a lot of tech companies start building these functions in-house with the support of third parties like Mixpanel, etc. So yeah, that's going to be super interesting to see. So a lot more focus on data science. And that's going to have a knock-on effect on how you think about marketing in general from a campaign's perspective. So, yeah.
Amazing. I also wanted to speak a bit about iOS 14, but this will be for the next panel. And in this stage, guys, I'm happy to hear any questions. We have a couple of minutes, so if you have any questions, happy to go through that.
I've got one. I found it interesting what you're saying about different users being just different, and there's not just a one-size-fits-all for retention. Have you got any tips for how you approach that conversation with sort of stakeholders who are expecting sort of a steady retention pattern? Because as you say, we know that they're all different. How do we approach that conversation and say actually it's okay that this person only comes back once a month?
I mean, I think you need like supporting evidence one way or the other. I think, what I mentioned is the discovery process around starting with like customer interviews and focus groups and understanding what the patterns might be, and then trying to figure out how you can actually segment that in your data, right? So for us, for example, we differentiate completely between people who use our product only for sleep for their children and people who use it on a regular basis for trying to help their kids focus when they come home from school. So you have to start with understanding what those user journey are and then actually figure out how you can find that supporting data. So it's a discovery process, but the reality is stakeholders will always want evidence of that. So whatever evidence you can find.
Do we have time for one more questions, or we are out of time? So, one more, yeah.
Question for Vito. How do you manage to align the tone of voice? Because I think that's a big thing for Monzo and across your CRM channels, social, customer service, everything else. I feel like you've got a very strong tone of voice, and I assume quite a big team and different copywriters working on that. How have you managed to do that, and how important is that for retention?
So that is fundamental because it's what distinguishes us from the way that other banks talk to their customers, first and foremost. In terms of how we have defined that and how we maintain that, so it was defined very early on. I think tone of voice for the vast majority of companies is defined within the first year and a half of when they're founded. And we had the fortune of having pretty good copywriters right from the start. Right now, we have a brand book and a tone of voice guideline, which is actually public, I think, and you can find, where all of the different channels, whether it's marketing channels, product, they all kind of try and talk about a product or speak to customers in the same way. We'll have checks, we have governance checks. Obviously, we're regulated quite heavily, so we need to make sure that the way we talk to customers is consistent. But also that we don't say illegal stuff, which is actually quite easy to do without realizing it. So governance and making sure we have a checking system under a marketing lens is super important. So a brand copywriter will always kind of overlook what's going out from a communications perspective.
I think this is about time. I think they will throw us out in like 10 seconds. Thank you guys for being here and very funny questions.
Thanks, everyone.